there's a name that comes up in your work quite a bit. So I want to ask, who is Tsutomu Miyazaki?
Tsutomu Miyazaki, or Miyazaki Tsutomu in the Japanese order, either way, Miyazaki was a man who in the late 1980s, in 1988 and 89, kidnapped, murdered, mutilated, and molested 4 girls between the age of 4 and 7. So he's a horrific serial killer and a serial sexual predator. One of the most infamous in Japanese history for a couple reasons. One is that he captured the sort of attention of the media in a kind of way that hadn't really happened for quite a while leading up to this. So he sort of terrorized the families by sending them letters with cutout text from the newspaper and so on, and even sending them parts of his victims and so on. And so he was a kind of spectacular, performative serial killer, as many are, and he captured the imagination of people who were really fearful of this in a nation that's really well-known, renowned for very low crime rates. Even more so violent crime rates, even more so sexual violent crime rates, even more so sexual violent crime against young people. Right? So because all these statistics didn't really suggest that this was going to happen, there was a lot of fear around this, like what went wrong, what happened. And so after almost a year, they captured this individual, Miyazaki, and turned out that he was an avid media fan. So he had lots and lots of videotapes, some that he had bought, others that he had recorded. He had a lot of technology, printers, things like that. And so he kind of was this folk devil, if you will, to use that kind of language of the moral panic. So he was an individual that embodied a lot of fears at the time. So we're all consumers, right? We're all media fans, right? We're all collectors to some extent, right? He was all of these things, but in a way that was terrifying. It seemed like this had really messed him up. So one of the things that really stood out about him, his physical deformities, his relationship or non-relationship with his family, his being bullied, all these things kind of were, of course, central to what went on, but this really stood out for a lot of people. The idea that he had thousands, almost 6,000 videotapes. And from here, an interesting thing happens. So instead of saying horror films, for example, are responsible for this, instead it shifted a little bit and it became, well, what makes him different is a kind of, he consumes different media to a different extent, was the narrative. And so he became sort of known as a manga anime fan. He had gone to the comic market, he had produced fanzines, he owned manga magazines and anime tapes, as at this point many people did. But this kind of stood out to a lot of reporters who began to sort of talk about this dangerous, again, a dangerous population, and that became known as the otaku generation, Miyazaki as an otaku, but also kind of the specter of the otaku killer. So to return to some of the earlier things we were discussing, the kind of population, the dangerous population, the ways in which it seemed like he had lost track of what was real and what was fictional. He had kind of learned from the media, acted it out, and then returned it to the media. So Miyazaki Tsutomu sort of started that in the mainstream media. He became the sort of poster boy for the dangerous otaku generation. But there's also a competing one, and that competing image is of the manga anime fan who's not confused about the difference between fiction and reality. In fact, he knows the distinction, and he insists on it, and he's attracted to fiction as such. Among manga anime fans, there was a sort of movement of people who were very interested in the characters of manga and anime. And they weren't just interested in, the stories around them. They were interested in the characters themselves. They were like, this character is great. I want to draw fanzines about this character. I want figurines of this character. If there's no figurines, I'll make the figurines. I'll do garage kits. There's an outpouring of affection for characters. And there sort of emerged a genre of magazine, niche magazine, that was focusing specifically on these fans by giving sort of pin-up images of these girls. So people would draw manga anime characters as idols and talk about them as two-dimensional idols. And these fans, these manga anime fans, were really excited about this. They're celebrating these characters, which are so-called bishoujo characters, the cute girl characters. So the emergence of those characters in the late 70s, early 1980s sort of set the ground. So the explosion of interest in those characters was sort of reflected in magazines like Manga Buriko, which was about these pinup girls, these anime pinup girls. And so people looked at this and they said, whoa, that is some pretty weird stuff, isn't it? They said. Isn't it strange that these people are, so excited by these characters, who actually treat them like idols, right? Who are oriented towards them, who take them as sex objects, as sex symbols. Wow. I mean, they don't have interest in the real thing. They've chosen the two-dimensional. They have a two-dimensional complex, the discourse said. You know what? These guys with the two-dimensional complex, they're weird enough that we need to sort of separate them out from the rest of us. They'll be the otaku. So that was the beginning of that discourse. That was the first time the term was used as a negative label. So it was manga anime fans calling other manga anime fans weirdos. And what was weird about them was they were attracted to, oriented towards, open to the effect of fictional characters, manga anime characters. So that discourse of the two-dimensionally oriented fan, manga anime fan, as the otaku, exists side by side with that other discourse, which is the Miyazaki Stomu discourse. And that really overshadows this other one, which is in some ways, I think, quite unfortunate, because these two things could not be more separate. So, for example, in the late 70s, early 80s, Lolicon was in many ways almost synonymous with two-dimensional complex. So if you were attracted to, oriented towards the manga anime character, and if that was kind of, considered to be pathological, they would say, okay, that person has a two-dimensional complex, that person is a lolicon, that person is an otaku, right? So it was very central to that original sort of debate about the orientation of desire towards fiction. So once again, we have this kind of confusion, right? We have, on the one hand, that kind of two-dimensionally oriented fan, and what lolicon meant in that sense. And then we have this other one, which is from the sort of Miyazaki Stomu lineage, and that's lolicon as the potentially predatory manga anime fan. Because the conflation of these two, or the overshadowing of the one by the other, makes it very, very difficult to have any sort of discussion about what exactly is going on. And so what Moe did, to return to that, what's fascinating about Moe is it once again insists on the fictional character, right? So the people who are responding this way are saying it's the fictional character that I'm responding to, not as a replacement or as a, in some way a stand-in for something more real. No, it's the character that I'm responding to. So that kind of insistence on the relationship with the character makes crystal clear what was already clear, that there's a distinction between three-dimensional and two-dimensional in this kind of fan community. And that sort of got muddled along the way by a lot of negative publicity and press. And I think what happens in a lot of the reporting today is people sort of will focus on one or not the other, or they'll confuse the two for one another. They'll sort of weave them together. And this, I think, makes it very, very difficult to, again, have a productive discussion. The majority of manga anime fans do not seem confused about this. They've developed literacies. They know when they're watching cartoons. They've grown up with cartoons. They'll tell you everything you want to know about cartoons. And if you insist that there's no difference between fiction and reality, they'll carefully and slowly tell you, if you hear them, that you're confused. They're not confused. You're confused. I think that's actually an interesting debate to have, right? So what I tried to do with for example, the Moe Manifesto was just listen, right? So hear their words, translate their words, and put it out there. So now we can actually say, maybe we're not hearing what they're saying. Maybe we need to rethink what we thought was common sense, what we think is so clearly a problem. And this might, in fact, allow us to then ask questions that would make more sense to the manga anime fans instead of sort of judging them without ever bothering to engage them in conversation. One thing about manga anime at this time of incredible sort of growth and sort of the spread, and we're all more and more connected to each other, so I think we're sort of getting that infrastructure that helps us to sort of have these communications. I mean, there's a lot of people who are learning translation, who are helping to sort of have discussions across those linguistic barriers. So we're, I think now more than ever, having sort of robust discussions about media, and I think it doesn't have to happen in these closed spaces of the conference or the academic publication, the university. And I think instead we might be thinking about how this infrastructure, which is coming together so beautifully, might be in fact kind of giving us the chance to really think with each other in a way that would be very productive. So I encourage everyone who's interested in sort of manga anime and all that sort of thing, but especially in sort of thinking through these things with others. You don't have to necessarily go somewhere else and do that, or, think through theory to do that. You can also engage people in interesting discussions, and that helps to open up these spaces where we can then develop literacies and language and so on to then speak with increasingly more and more nuance to really get to points that will will really help us all to think and move and live together.